Have you heard of the Pareto principle? The Pareto principle basically says that to achieve 80% of the results, it takes 20% of the effort. Today, I'm gonna teach you 80% of photography in 10 minutes. Now remember, 20% of the effort is gonna get you 80% of the way there, but it takes a lot more to really become a great photographer. When I learn something new, I like to look at it in its simplest form. I tell people, talk to me like I'm a 5-year-old. Once I have that basic understanding, that core knowledge, that like solid foundation of what this thing is, then I can build on top of it and really dig into the complexities of it. That's what we're gonna do with photography. Today, I'm gonna get you 80% of the way there so that you're creating awesome images, and when you're not creating awesome images, you'll be able to troubleshoot and figure out why. Here we go, 10 minutes. First up is ISO, and it's the first thing that I'm gonna set in any given scenario. The basic gist here is that ISO is the sensitivity of your camera's sensor. The higher the number, the more sensitive to light your camera sensor is gonna be. The lower the number, the less sensitive. So you might be thinking, crank that ISO up. Well, I want lots of light. I want to be able to pull all the light. It's kind of the opposite actually. You want to keep your ISO as low as possible, because the higher the ISO, the more grain, the more noise, the more artifacts and weird funky things are in your image. To show how ISO works, I did a little test shoot of one of my favorite lenses. Here is ISO 100, here's 200, here's 400, 800, 1600, 3200 and 6400. This is a Sony a7R II, so just for fun. Here is 12,800 and 25,600. That is a little fun. ISO is a big reason that camera body prices fluctuate so much. A cheaper camera might be able to go to 800 or 1600 ISO before getting really grainy and noisy, while a more expensive camera can go up to 3200, 6400, 10,000, and beyond, and still be pretty usable. In general with photography, you pay more to get more light. So outside where there's plenty of light, I'm gonna have my ISO at 100. In the shade, 200. Now when I come indoors, I'm gonna bump my ISO to 400, or maybe 800, 1600 even. On this camera, I think 3200 ISO looks awesome, and I'm at 3200 ISO on this camera a lot. So remember, ISO is your camera sensor's sensitivity. The higher the number, the more light, but the more noise. So keep your ISO low. Next up is aperture. Aperture is the size of the opening in your lens. This one is simple, and you can actually see it happening. Your lens has blades inside that actually open and close to create a smaller or larger hole. That hole size is your aperture. Now this one's a little confusing because the smaller the number, the bigger the hole and the more light comes in. The higher the number, the smaller the hole and the less light comes in. And you'll see this number written in f-stops. Don't worry why it's written like that, it's a math thing. I'll probably get into it in another video. Cheaper lenses that might have come with your camera, like the Canon 18-55 kit lens that comes with a lot of Canon cameras, it goes from f3.5 to f38. And Sony's kit lens, I think, is f3.5 to f36. Which means at f36, it's a tiny little hole, and at f3.5, it's bigger, and it's gonna let more light in. So the higher the number, less light, lower the number, more light. Then you move to lenses in like the $1,500 to $2,500 range, like this guy. This is Sony's 85mm f1.4, which means it can open up huge and let in a ton of light. So with aperture, the lower the number, the more light there is, the higher the number, the less light there is. But aperture mainly controls depth of field. So I kind of want you to forget that first part about aperture. Understand that that's how it works, but this is how we use it. Depth of field is super simple. It's basically how much is in focus in front of and behind the actual spot that you focused on. And here's where it gets simple. The lower the f-stop number, the smaller the depth of field. The higher the f-stop number, the more depth of field. So here's that shot of my lens again. This time on a ruler, so you can see the depth of field. The first shot is at f1.4. The second shot, f2, f2.8, f4, f5.6, f8, f11, and f16. You can see how as the aperture number went up, the depth of field did as well. In any given scene, the first thing I'm gonna do is set my ISO based on the actual scene. The second thing I'm gonna do is set my aperture based on my subject. If I'm shooting one person for a portrait, I'm gonna go really low with that depth of field. I might shoot at f2 or f2.5. But if I'm shooting a group of people, I'm gonna crank my aperture up a little bit, maybe somewhere in like the f3.5 to f4 range, because I need more depth of field to make sure that everyone that's in that line is in focus. Then if I'm shooting a landscape where I want the tree in front of me and the mountain in the distance all in focus, I'm gonna go up to f16, maybe f22, something where everything is gonna be in focus and there'll be nothing blurry. Those like super tack sharp landscape images, usually somewhere around f16. So to recap, aperture is the size of the opening in your lens. The lower the f-stop, more light. Higher the f-stop, less light. But remember that aperture controls depth of field, which is way more important in creating an image. So low f-stop, small depth of field, higher f-stop, large depth of field. Pretty simple, right? Last up is shutter speed, and shutter speed is super simple. Shutter speed is the amount of time, measured in seconds, that your shutter is open. With shutter speed, you'll see numbers like 1/50th of a second, 1/100th of a second, 1/250th of a second. It goes all the way up to 1/8000th of a second, depending on your camera. And you can go the other way, and you can slow your shutter speed down to 1 second, or 2 seconds, or 5 seconds, or 10 seconds. Most cameras go up to 30 seconds without something called an intervalometer. I use my intervalometer. It's very interesting. While shutter speed controls the amount of time that your shutter is open, it also controls motion blur. From a lot of motion blur, all the way up into where moving objects are just totally frozen in place. Super slow shutter speeds are gonna be used when you're on a tripod, shooting something like a landscape or a cool waterfall, and you want that what's that? Looks like smoke, but it's water. Looks really cool. All the way up to shooting like 3-minute exposures and getting really cool star Milky Way shots. All the way to the other side where you want to freeze motion. Shutter speed is what helps you accomplish that. Faster shutter speeds are going to be used in things like sports, or maybe someone's running or your dog is running in the backyard and you want that really crispy shot of your dog just frozen in place. When I'm shooting portraits, I don't want any motion blur in my images. I want people looking nice and crispy. So I'm gonna shoot somewhere between 1/250th of a second and 1/500th of a second. If my subjects start walking or start running or something like that, I'm gonna go a little faster. And if it's low light and I need the extra light, I'll go a little slower and I'll get them to stand really still so it's still nice and sharp. For sports, you're gonna be somewhere in like the 1/800th range, maybe 1/1000th, and even beyond. Basically, the faster your subject is moving, if you wanna freeze them, you need a faster shutter speed. So the total basics of shutter speed is slower shutter speed, more motion blur, faster shutter speed, less motion blur. That's it. And now to put it all together. So anytime I'm gonna take a shot, I'm gonna walk into the scene, and the first thing I'm gonna do is set my ISO. So I'm gonna look at the scene. If I'm outdoors, there's plenty of light, I'm gonna bring that ISO as low as I can, maybe 200 or 100. Second, I'm gonna look at my subject. I'm gonna choose how much depth of field do I need for that one person or 2 people or 5 people, and I'm gonna set my aperture based on that. And then third, I'm gonna choose how much motion blur I want or don't want and set my shutter speed based on that. So here's 2 quick scenarios. I get everything set for my shot, my subject is totally ready, I get everything dialed, I look at my shot and it's too dark. There's 3 places I can go to get more light. The first thing I'm gonna do is slow my shutter speed down, but I can only do that until I start seeing motion blur in my image. Second, I'm gonna lower my aperture. It's gonna let more light in, but I can only do that until my subject isn't in focus because I don't have enough depth of field for them. And the third place to find more light is to bump my ISO. It's my last resort. I don't wanna bump my ISO, but I will. And again, depending on your camera, that's either gonna be a really bad thing, or in cameras like this, it's not gonna really be that big of a deal. The second scenario is the exact opposite. I get everything dialed in, I take my test shot, and it's too bright. Now the first thing I'm gonna do this time is my ISO, because I have plenty of light. So I'm gonna crank that thing down, and I'm gonna get a really nice clean image because of that. Now if I crank my ISO all the way down, it's still too bright. The second thing I do is I start raising my shutter speed. And the very last thing that I would change is my aperture. I really enjoy that low depth of field look when I'm shooting portraits. So aperture is the last thing that I mess with. There's a ton of great charts out there that are an awesome reference to just always have on hand. I made one for you right now. Be ready to screenshot in 3, 2, 1. And that's it. That is 80% of photography in 10 minutes. I did it. For all you advanced photographers out there, I realize there is way more that makes up photography and that makes a good photographer. But as like the basic foundational elements, If you can understand those three concepts and how your camera uses them, you're gonna be able to take awesome images and you're gonna be able to troubleshoot when you see something wrong. So if you see that you don't have enough depth of field, you know that your aperture has to go up. Higher number, more depth of field. If your image is super grainy, you know your ISO has to come down. And lastly, if there's blur in your images, you know that your shutter speed has to go up. And that's it. Hit the subscribe button below. I'm gonna have a ton more videos out. Leave comments below asking questions about photography, and I'll make videos like this answering them. Yeah, that's all I got. If this whole time you were really upset because I was saying ISO instead of ISO, you're wrong. It's ISO, not ISO. It's not an acronym. Look it up.
Movies are made up of a series of images. Some are beautiful, some are harsh, and some stick in our minds forever. Like the gently rolling spaceships in 2001: A Space Odyssey, or Peter O'Toole riding out of the desert in Lawrence of Arabia, or Darth Vader emerging from the smoke in Star Wars. But who actually takes these pictures? If the director is the one who sets the vision for the film, whose job is it to bring that vision to life? That's the person who puts the pictures in motion pictures, the cinematographer. Cinematographers must be artists, engineers, photographers, and storytellers all at once. Sometimes you'll hear the cinematographer referred to as the director of photography, or DP, but don't be confused, it's the same job. In some parts of the world, they prefer one title to the other, but generally speaking, the two titles are interchangeable. And no matter what they call themselves, it's their basic job to translate the director's vision into things like framing, lighting, and camera movement, so that the film's story, emotions, and themes are conveyed visually. A cinematographer must not only possess great technical skills, but also understand the fundamental narrative beats of the film, the arc of the characters, and how the shots might cut together in the editing room. And the job begins long before the cameras start to roll. During pre-production, the cinematographer assembles the camera department, plans the shots with the directors, and determines any special equipment that might be necessary for the shoot, from cranes to dollies to Steadicams and special lenses. They also help the director decide what kind of film stock or digital cameras to use and what the overall look of the film will be. During production itself, the cinematographer oversees the lighting and shooting of the film, shot by shot. This includes supervising the camera department and working very closely with the lighting department, the head of which you'll recall is the gaffer. Since pictures are technically just a record of light bouncing off objects, the gaffer is fundamental to achieving the images that make up the film. And when it comes to the lights themselves, the cinematographer has a lot to choose from. For example, there are Fresnel lights, which use special lenses called Fresnel lenses to produce a wide, hard light that softens around the edges. Commonly used for stage lighting, these lights can get very hot very quickly. Fluorescent lights are much cooler and softer, but they're quite fragile, which matters on a film set when lights are being moved around so frequently. LED lights create very little heat and are favored by a lot of independent and DIY cinematographers because they're cheap and they use less power. However, the colors and shadows they cast can be unreliable and difficult to match bulb to bulb. Incandescent lights, meanwhile, generate a lot of heat, but they generally give a warm yellow light that can be very appealing. And then we have HMIs, or this. These are massive lights that give off an enormous amount of heat. They're so bright that they're often used to simulate daylight, as in the sun. So that's the hardware, but in addition to choosing which of these lights should be used, the cinematographer also has a say in how they're arranged. The most basic style of lighting used in everything from formal interviews to fiction films is three-point lighting. You start with a key light, which is the brightest light, often positioned so that it shines most directly on the subject of the shot. Then you add some fill light, which is a dimmer and more diffused light to fill in the shadows created by the key light. Finally, backlight, which is usually brighter than the fill light, shines from behind the subject of the shot. This creates a halo or edge of light that outlines the subject and separates it from the background. One of the questions cinematographers grapple with is figuring out where the light is coming from in the world of the film. This will determine the direction, color, intensity, and quality of light that illuminates the shot. Sometimes cinematographers will use practical lights, which are light sources you can actually see in the shot, like desk lamps or windows. Other times, they'll deliberately use artificial lights, or even turn to a more radical strategy to light their films. Cinematographers Nestor Almendros and Haskell Wexler famously shot Terrence Malick's Days of Heaven using natural sunlight, mostly that brief period of the day immediately before sunset, called magic hour. While working on Catch-22, David Watkins said, "I'm gonna do something rather daring. I'm gonna light the actors with only explosions." And he did. Ellen Curtis relied on a unique combination of practical and artificial lights to create the unusual transitions and effects of Jim Carrey's memory loss in Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. Malik Hassan Saeed is a master of style, shooting everything from Spike Lee's He Got Game to Beyoncé's Lemonade. When Gordon Willis decided to light The Godfather in such a way that Marlon Brando's eyes would often be in shadow, it was seen as a risky and daring strategy. Cinematographers were supposed to light a character's eyes. That's just how it was done. Instead, Willis chose to use this lighting mistake to illustrate the dark and unknowable soul of Don Corleone. Now, the cinematographer also works closely with the production designer, who's the head of the art department. The production designer is in charge of carrying out the whole look of the film, particularly the physical elements like sets, costumes, props, hair and makeup, but also non-physical elements like computer-generated images and how they interact with physical objects on camera. The cinematographer and the production designer work closely on everything from the color scheme of a set to how reflective its walls should be. And for sure, in addition to the lighting, cinematographers have to consider all kinds of factors when setting up their shots. Not only do the shots need to cut together to tell the story, but they're often constructed to have a beginning, middle, and end all their own. The director and cinematographer must decide how much of the frame should be in focus, using lens choice, film stock, and aperture. Related to that, the cinematographer has to think about what's featured in the foreground, middle ground, and the background of the shot. The arrangement of these features within a frame can have a profound impact on the audience. Color and contrast also fall within the cinematographer's aesthetic toolkit. Color can be used to draw the eye from one part of the frame to the other, make narrative or thematic links, or, as in The Wizard of Oz, transport us to an entirely new place. Contrast, which refers to the ratio of the darkest parts of the image to the lightest parts, can perform many of the same functions. Before there was color in film, contrast was a particularly powerful tool for cinematographers. Noir classics like Carol Reed's The Third Man use deep, dark shadows cut by bright shafts of light to convey a sense of mystery and menace. Cinematographers might also decide to move the camera to evoke a particular feeling or psychological effect. This movement might be as simple as a pan or a tilt to follow the action, or as involved as Citizen Kane's dramatic crane shot in through the top of the nightclub. Moving the camera in toward a character can convey a variety of emotions, from fear closing in on them to some kind of internal revelation. There are some pretty entertaining supercuts of push-in shots on YouTube. It makes you realize this technique is used everywhere. Now, what happens after the film is in the can? The job's over, right? Of course not. The cinematographer can be heavily involved in a film's post-production too, because the editing process offers lots of opportunities to manipulate the images that have been captured. If a movie's been shot on film, there are all kinds of options to change color or exposure by altering chemicals and timing, as the exposed negative is developed and processed. But whether the film was shot using traditional film stock or a digital process, most feature films are digitized at some point to make the editing easier. And once the images have been converted into digital information, even more options open up for manipulating the footage. Filters on photo apps like Instagram give you some idea of how drastically you can change a digital image after it's been shot. In order to maintain the look of the film, the cinematographer is almost always deeply engaged in this process, working hand in hand with the director, the editor, the post-production supervisor who's overseeing this phase of the process, and the special effects department. So yeah, it's kind of a big job. There's a fantastic documentary called Visions of Light that traces the history and art of cinematography. It's out of print, but if you can find a copy of it, you can hear some of the original masters of the medium share their stories and see examples of their work. As with much of film production, there are guidelines and customs when it comes to cinematography, but no actual rules. The right style of lighting or camera movement for one film will be completely wrong for another. It's up to the cinematographer to work with the director to realize their vision for the film, and then to translate it into images that will cut together to tell the story. Mise-en-scène literally means placing on stage, but in film, mise-en-scène encompasses everything the camera is capturing. It's the set and how it's lit. It's how the subjects are framed. It's the actors and how they look and what they're wearing. It's the props they're holding and the set dressing they're moving through. Just as every line of dialogue and every shot should be helping move the film forward, everything in frame should be helping build the mise-en-scène. From the overall look and feel of the sets to the details and the makeup on the actors' faces, everything in a film is designed and captured for a reason. Sometimes mise-en-scène is pretty obvious. Think of the German expressionist film, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, or any film by Tim Burton or Wes Anderson. These films are clearly stylized. The audience can tell that the sets, costumes, and makeup were all created and crafted by somebody. But sometimes the mise-en-scène is more subtle, like in the realist film Winter's Bone, or films by Lynn Ramsey or Kelly Reichardt. The world portrayed in realist films might make the audience wonder what a production designer even did to build the world, because the scenes look so much like the world we live in. But look carefully at the world in a realist film. Just as the cinematographer uses the language of the camera to help tell the story, the teams creating the mise-en-scène structure the set and the actors in specific ways to bring the director's vision to life. The production designer creates the physical world of the film. This person leads the art department, which builds and decorates the sets. Early in pre-production, the production designer is hired to work with the director to develop the look of the film. Depending on when and where the script is set, they'll probably have to research what to include and exclude when building their world. For example, I was in a film that took place in the 1970s, and there was a scene shot next to a building with corrugated metal siding. Because of his experience and research, the production designer knew that the shape of that metal corrugation wasn't developed until the 1980s. So to make the scene accurate to the time, he had the art department bring in old corrugated metal and hung it over the new metal. This might seem silly. I mean, who besides the production designer is going to know what year corrugated metal changed shape? But even if we don't know the year, subconsciously we feel the differences. Imagine a scene in a classroom from your childhood. If you grew up in the 1990s and a film about your childhood years included students writing on chalk slates, or if you grew up in the 1960s and the film included a smartboard, both of those things would feel wrong. So as soon as the production designer gets the script, they begin researching the time period and the location where the story takes place to get the feeling just right. It might even be a time period in the future or a make-believe place, but they still start with research. After that, the production designer prepares plans and drawings for the sets that need to be built, and they go on early location scouts with the directors so they can begin planning how they'll use a location. Then they'll present the director with their ideas for designing the setting. Once they've agreed upon a plan with the director, the art department gets to work. They work with the set decorator, also called a scenic designer, to research and implement every detail they'll bring into the world of the film. While the production designer is creating the look of the film overall, the set decorator is choosing the details and designing the sets. The production designer also works with the art director to budget and organize the department. They hire buyers who buy or rent set dressing and props. Once the set is designed, the art department builds anything that doesn't already exist for the set itself, as well as any other special props that are needed. The art department masterminds what the physical world of the story looks like, but if the characters don't look and feel like they belong in that world, then it's all for nothing. The costume designer and the wardrobe department, along with the hair and makeup departments, also play pivotal roles in creating the mise-en-scène. And the work of any designer starts, again, with research. The costume designer uses pre-production to study the setting and time period, including the season when the film takes place. The costume designer's most important job, though, is to understand the characters and how they grow throughout the film. By developing a signature look for a character, the designer can help convey the story's plots and themes. Maggie Smith plays both Professor McGonagall in the Harry Potter series and Miss Shepherd in The Lady in the Van. Two very different characters with very different backstories and goals. The wardrobe of the character can convey more about them than their opening lines. And as characters change over the course of their story, that change is often shown outwardly, and not just in makeover montages. In Jurassic World, for example, Bryce Dallas Howard's character Claire starts out in nearly all white clothes, implying that she's never outside with the dinosaurs and is disconnected from the reality of the park she works in. But the costume designer played with what the audience already knew of the original Jurassic Park and mapped out Claire's wardrobe changes to quote those of Laura Dern's character from the 1993 film. That way, she becomes more connected with the story and thus more capable in our minds. Design decisions like this help the audience get pulled into the film, but they also help the actors get into the minds of their characters. The director Tom Ford, who started his career in the fashion industry, has even sewn labels into his actors' costumes so that they never feel like costumes, but the characters' clothes themselves. This extra detail isn't something the camera or the audience will ever see, but when your job as an actor is to believe in a pretend world while you're surrounded by crew and lights, it makes the world a little more real and your job a little easier. This is true not just of the clothes actors wear, but also the makeup they use and how their hair is styled. Hair and makeup, or HMU, are usually referred to as a single unit on set, and they often share a trailer, but they're two separate specialized careers. As with production and costume designers, pre-production is all about research and planning. Hairdressers work with the director to develop how they'll style their actors' hair. They'll prep any dyes, wigs, extensions, or bald caps that they might need. Because films are rarely shot in order, hairstylists need to be organized and plan how to maintain continuity throughout the film. This is often a reason wigs are used instead of dyeing hair. If scheduling demands that an actor play a gray-haired version of their character on either side of a dark-haired version, for example, then it can be easier to work with wigs than back-to-back dyeing. And making a wig look just as realistic as real hair can be tricky. If it's a period piece, they'll need to know how to create a time-appropriate look, but with the safety and health standards of current times. This is true for makeup artists, too. Makeup artists need to understand each actor's skin and create a plan that keeps the actor as comfortable as possible while also creating the look that the film demands. Makeup is similar to lighting or editing in that it usually has to be seen but not noticed. Whether you're making a beautiful person camera ready or building a look out of latex and airbrushing, the audience needs to be connecting with the character and their internal life, not getting distracted by their makeup. Some makeup artists specialize in special effects makeup, but all makeup artists need to know how to create certain illusions like cuts, bruises, scars, bad teeth, and tattoos. Of all the departments on set, makeup, hair, and wardrobe spend the most time with the actors. Each department has a trailer at base camp, but will also send a representative to set with the actors. When the first AD calls last looks, they're telling these 3 people to check the actor's makeup, hair, and clothing to make sure it's camera ready. It's their job to make sure the actors don't have to think about these things and can focus on their work of being present in the scene. And of course, all the designers working on a film need to communicate between departments to create the mise-en-scène and help tell the story. A really bright example of how this can all come together is the character Clementine in Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. The costume designer, hair and makeup team, and the production designer work together to make the audience associate the color orange with Clementine. Whether it's her hair color or her bright orange sweatshirt, they took inspiration from her name and the script and brought it into the mise-en-scène. And if you pay close attention, they give us a big hint about the end of the movie by aligning her character with that color. That movie came out over 10 years ago, so I don't think I'm spoiling anything by saying it's about removing the memory of Clementine from the brain of her ex-boyfriend, Joel. The costume designer and the set decorator took great care in making everything in Joel's world appear in grays and blues. But when Joel wakes up from having his memory erased, everything in the scene is gray or blue except one orange vase. Like every real character we come to love in our favorite movies, Clementine isn't completely erased. Have you ever tried to take a picture of a sunset? How'd it turn out? Probably looked pretty bad compared to the real thing, right? Now, have you ever taken a picture of your friend when she was lit by the sunset? Probably looked amazing. The sun can be so fickle, but we need it for life. Luckily, we don't need it for filmmaking anymore. We can recreate a sunset and make it last for hours. We can light a lightning storm or make a room look like it's lit with just a few candles, but still be able to actually see. Light can accentuate drama or play up humor or build suspense, and without it, the camera literally captures nothing. Without light, film is radio. And the production departments that control all the light are usually grouped together as G and E. Grip and electric. We've talked about the designers who build the mise-en-scène through sets, costumes, hair, and makeup, but lighting design is just as important. A blank wall can be transformed with light and shadow. I mean, you know this, and Instagram can be made into art by controlling light and shadow. This is part of the reason grip and electric work together so well. The electricians bring in and control the light, while the grips control the shadow. Both the grip and electric teams work together as an arm of the camera team. The gaffer, Best Boy Electric, and electricians work with the cinematographer to design the lighting. And the key grip, Best Boy Grip, and grips work with all the non-electrical equipment for the lighting and camera departments. The electrical lighting technicians, or ELT, are responsible for getting light, but also power to the set. Like almost every other crew position, it's a mix of creativity and technical skill. When it comes to lighting, though, it's especially technical. Like, there's math. The electric department has to make a new plan for every lighting setup at every location. This plan is informed by the look the director and cinematographer want to achieve, but also by the power that's available on site or from the generators they're able to bring. So the electric team isn't just lighting a set, they're also bringing power to it. A lot of power that could be deadly if it's not handled safely. But who's responsible for safety on a set? That's easy. You are. There are too many moving parts and changing orders on a film set for safety to not be everyone's priority. So trust me when I say if an electrician tells you to do something on set, do it. It's for your safety and everyone else's. The gaffer and the electric team have to understand the capacity of their equipment and the power supplies that they're pulling from. They also need to stay up to date on technology changes. LED lights, for example, are just starting to be used on sets. But of course, the whole purpose of the electrical department's technical skill is to put it to use creatively and convincingly. It can be easy to think of light as just light, but think of the light in an old church or the light in a big box store. They're different, right? Think of a cold, rainy beach or a sunny mountaintop. It's the same sun, but they look so different. Grip and electric teams work to control light, and one of the most important tools at their disposal is understanding color temperature. Think again about that old church versus that rainy beach. They're about the same brightness, but they're different colors. The light in the church is what we would call warm. It's kind of orange, whereas the light in the beach is cool, looks more blue. That's because the light has different color temperatures, which we measure in Kelvin, or K. Typically, outdoor lighting is around 5600 K, or what we call daylight balanced, because the sun's light is 5600 K. Indoor lighting is 3200 K, or tungsten, because tungsten is what the filaments in incandescent light bulbs are made from, and it puts out light at 3200 K. Obviously, there's a whole lot of wiggle room between those, and the camera needs to be set up to match the color temperature of the lights. When you see a video that looks really orange, it's because the lights are tungsten, but the camera is set to daylight balance, and vice versa when the video looks really blue. You can get bulbs that are either daylight balanced or tungsten, but if you only have one type of bulb to light your film inside and out, you can change their color temperature pretty affordably with gels. Gels are transparent color filters. They come in many colors, but they're most commonly used in blue or orange, and they come in different densities too, depending on how much light you're working with. Once the color temperature is right for the scene, G&E still has to control how the light moves. We talked about the basic 3-point lighting setup when we talked about cinematography. The key light, the fill light, and the backlight or hair light all work together to give a scene depth and allow the audience to feel like they're looking at a real space, not a screen. But you don't just put up 3 lights in a triangle. The electricians and grips shape the light to create the look the gaffer and cinematographer want. Under the direction of the gaffer, the electricians use the lights themselves to do this, and the grips use several tools to block and steer the light. Because remember that fickle sun? Light will go wherever you let it, but it needs to be guided. The first way to do this is with different lights. The key, fill, and hair lights usually descend in order of intensity. The key will put out the most light, then the fill, then the hair light. But not all light sources are lights. Frequently, the fill light is just light from the key light bouncing off of a white wall, a mirror, or, appropriately enough, a bounce board. A skilled grip can aim light with a bounce board, but beyond that, there are many more ways to control the light. The lights themselves have barn doors that control how much light comes through and how it's aimed. Barn doors are also where you can clip your gels if you need them with your trusty C47s. G&E equipment gets the best names. A lot of the effort in lighting is spent trying to avoid unwanted shadows, but sometimes you need shadows to shape the light how you want it, and the grips have all the rigging and equipment to do that. Some of the most versatile pieces of equipment that grips use are flags mounted onto C-stands to block or cut the light. They'll block light for the camera, but because the grip department oversees pretty much all the non-electrical equipment for the set, they'll also block light for things like Video Village. And no, that's not the last of the DVD rental chains. It's where people who can't see the camera can watch the video playback of what the camera's capturing. For this, the team will usually use a special kind of flag called a floppy because it has a floppy drape that can be opened to block out more light. Flags are sometimes called cutters too because they break up the light sharply. But when the shadow needs to be more subtle, G&E will use diffusion. If the electricians want to lessen the intensity of a light, they can add diffusion to it, much like how they would add a gel. On some lights, they can add screens called scrims over the lens of the light. Grips can also bring in flags called silks to put in front of large lights to diffuse them. And really big silks are used to protect an entire set from the sun for an outdoor scene. Indoors, grips can control the light in a scene by using black wrap or cinefoil to direct light or seal the windows from sunlight. Now, not only do grips have the power to block out the sun and build the rigging for light and shadow, they also build and manage the equipment for the camera department. In fact, the ways in which the camera moves are almost all built and maintained by the grips. If it's a locked down shot, the grips set up the tripod. If it's a dolly shot, grips lay the dolly track and control the dolly movements. If the shot calls for a jib or a crane, grips build and control this movement as well. Even handheld shots often rely on grips because the camera operator may need to be up on a ladder, which may be held by a grip, or they may put the camera on an apple box between shots, which would be provided by the grip department. And I can't mention this enough, just like the electricians have to manage the safety of the electricity and cables and bulbs they're using, grips are always thinking about safety with equipment. From the way a C-stand is positioned to the way a screw is tightened, there is a protocol and a language for everything the grips are doing to keep everyone on set safe. Two of the most common words you'll hear from G&E are striking and points. Striking is called when an electrician is turning on a light. It's a courtesy for anyone on set to look away from the bright light, but it's also a warning that something potentially dangerous might happen. A fuse might blow, a bulb might break, and by calling striking, the crew is getting a heads up. Points means someone is carrying something big and pointy, probably a C-stand, so be aware and watch where you're moving. Knowing those two words will help keep you safe and also keep you from being obnoxious on a film set. All good things. Sometimes it's impractical or physically impossible to get the shot you want. Maybe the scene takes place on an imaginary planet. Maybe the film is about a magical creature. Maybe the story requires action that would be too dangerous to film in real life. That's when filmmakers turn to special effects and special effects makeup. If film is an illusion, special effects are simply one more way to achieve or enhance that illusion. Whether it's making Superman fly, allowing Fred Astaire to dance on the ceiling, or engineering a fight between Leonardo DiCaprio and one angry bear, vast teams of artists and craftspeople have devoted their working lives to making the impossible possible. Let's feast our eyes on the world of special effects. We think of special effects as a recent development, but it's actually been around in some form since the earliest days of cinema. Beginning with the trick films of Méliès, filmmakers have been using things like double exposure, matte painting, tinting, and creative cuts to create magic on screen. And they're still at it. James Cameron can take us to the bottom of the sea, twice, in The Abyss and Titanic. Ridley Scott can immerse us in the neon-drenched, futuristic LA of Blade Runner. Films like Zodiac and Far From the Madding Crowd can use special effects to transport us into the past. And James Gunn can launch us into space with a quip and a ship full of misfits in Guardians of the Galaxy. But special effects can also be used in much more subtle ways. Rather than drawing attention to themselves, these effects are meant to go undetected by the audience. Citizen Kane, for instance, is not much less fabricated than the original Star Wars. In fact, Orson Welles' classic film was a pioneer in visual effects, optically printing massive exterior shots and featuring sophisticated old age makeup, complete with cinema's first use of contact lenses to give characters cataracts. More recently, dramas like 2010's The Social Network used computer-generated imagery, or CGI, to complete city skylines and allow one actor, Armie Hammer, to portray twins. In Steven Soderbergh's Oscar-winning 2001 film Traffic, CGI was even used to create tears on a character's face to enhance their emotion. In fact, the vast majority of mainstream Hollywood movies of the 21st century include at least one shot that has been altered by special effects technology. Special effects can be broken down into several main types, which can be used on their own or combined to produce an image that meets the needs of the film. Mechanical or practical effects are special effects created on set. These include physical character creation, puppetry, animatronics, and more. Think of the cantina scene in the original Star Wars film, before Lucas went in and used computers to tinker with everything and no, I'm still not over it. All those creatures were either puppets, animatronics, or human actors wearing prosthetic makeup or costumes. Pyrotechnics, like fires or explosions, also fall under practical effects, along with wind, rain, mist, snow, and smoke. In some cases, even running water constitutes a practical effect. Unless the film is being shot in an actual location, someone has to plumb the set if you want water to run from the faucet. Optical effects are created in the camera as the film is being shot using optical instruments. A lot of these techniques require extra equipment, skills, and time, and nearly all of these effects are now easier and faster to create using computers. Optical printing involves a combination of the camera, a projector, and a special printer. You begin by filming a live action scene, matting out the section you want to replace. This is called the garbage matte. Then you film a shot that you'd like to use in place of the matted section. This is called a plate. Finally, you combine the two pieces of film in an optical printer and voila! Special effect. Compositing is a technique now commonly called blue screen or green screen. Originally, black screens were used. Actors would be filmed performing in front of the screen, and then the black screen would be replaced by a separately filmed background. The problem was dark shadows also appeared black. So any shadow on the actor's clothing or face would also be replaced by the background. Not a good look. Color cinematography and beam-splitting cameras allowed filmmakers to expose selective colors on 2 or 3 different negatives. Suddenly, it was possible to use a specific color for the screen, one that would be much easier to separate from the actors or their costumes. The first major use of blue screens in a feature film was the 1940 Technicolor spectacle, The Thief of Baghdad, which won Oscars for both cinematography and special effects. This technique continued to be refined until blue screens were the norm in the 1970s and 80s. Green screens have become more common since the advent of digital cinematography because green is less present in human skin and hair, and digital cameras are more sensitive to it. Filmmakers use both blue and green today depending on the camera being used and the costumes worn by the characters. For instance, you might not want to shoot Superman in front of a blue screen because it could make him look like nothing but a floating head, hands, boots, undies, and a big red S and cape. Again, not a good look. Optical effects can also include scale models, miniatures, and forced perspective props and sets. These techniques allowed Peter Jackson to turn full-sized human beings into hobbits and then have them interact with the human characters on the same set. Rotoscoping is an optical effect that involves hand tracing the subject of a shot, frame by frame, so that it can be animated or more meticulously matted into another shot. Stop motion, sometimes called claymation, involves shooting a model one still frame at a time, moving it slightly between each shot. The Imperial Walkers in The Empire Strikes Back were created using this technique, as well as animated films from Wallace and Gromit to The Fantastic Mr. Fox. Beginning in the 1970s, another weapon was added to the special effects arsenal: computer-generated imagery, or CGI. CGI covers everything from two-dimensional animation to the fully realized 3D world of something like Avatar. Basic rule of thumb is if the effect is made on a computer, it's some sort of CGI. The first mainstream feature film to use CGI was the original Westworld, directed by Michael Crichton in 1973, and its sequel, Future World, in 1976. The effects themselves were quite simple: a robot's vision of our world, a 3D rendering of a spinning hand, but they actually represented an enormous step forward in the art and craft of special effects. 9 years later, the very first photorealistic CGI character appeared in the film Young Sherlock Holmes, in which a stained glass window shatters and the shards come back together to form an animated sword-wielding knight. This moment paved the way for major advances in CGI character creation, from fantasy creatures like Gollum or Groot to recognizably human figures like Benjamin Button or the young Princess Leia at the end of Rogue One. Other aspects of CGI were equally revolutionary. Digital compositing made combining various images and image fields much quicker and easier. Keyframing, meanwhile, lets animators draw a character or object once and then sets points, or keyframes, to indicate how the image should move over a given amount of time. This saves artists from having to draw each frame of an image separately. Now, what if your canvas as a special effects artist is actually a person? Artists who specialize in special effects makeup are trained in the same skills as traditional hair and makeup artists, and then they develop more specialized expertise in creating things like injuries, old age, deformities, and the creation of monsters, aliens, and other creatures. One of the first filmmakers to excel at this kind of special effects makeup was the actor Lon Chaney Sr., nicknamed the Man of 1,000 Faces, for his ability to transform into other characters. He developed his own makeup techniques to star in silent-era horror classics like 1923's The Hunchback of Notre Dame and Rupert Julian's adaptation of The Phantom of the Opera. In the early days, major film studios had their own in-house effects teams. Then during the 1960s and 70s, the studios scaled back, and those teams set up their own special effects houses, which were then hired by the studios for specific projects. Today, some of the most famous brand names in the business include Industrial Light and Magic, founded in 1975 by George Lucas; Digital Domain, created in 1993 by filmmaker James Cameron, along with master creature creator Stan Winston and digital effects guru Scott Ross; and Peter Jackson's Weta Digital, which has created the effects-heavy drama Heavenly Creatures, most of the Lord of the Rings saga, and Avatar, among others. Now, whether it's in-house or not, the special effects team is usually overseen by a visual effects supervisor. Their job is to ensure that the effects fit the vision of the director and the needs of the film, and that the effects are completed on time and on budget. In order to accomplish this, they assemble and work with a variety of special effects artists, from digital matte painters and compositors to roto artists who specialize in rotoscoping, and lighting technical directors who work as gaffers in the digital space, making sure the direction, color, intensity, and mood of the lighting matches the rest of the film. Previs, or pre-visualization artists, help filmmakers anticipate what an effect will look like when the film is complete, and concept artists use illustrations to help filmmakers design effects, creatures, and environments. Other artists specialize in rendering, animation, weather design, enhancing explosions, combining all the elements into a finished effect, and on and on. Special effects is an ever-expanding field as new technologies emerge to make innovative effects possible. If you've ever watched the credits on an effects-heavy film, you know they list hundreds of names under special effects. All those artists spend their days working to make the impossible possible, to wow us with their imagery and to enhance the illusion of reality that is a film. A movie, as you know, is basically a sequence of shots. The shots themselves may be beautiful or strange, kinetic or still, bright or dark, and viewed individually, they might carry some meaning. But the real power of narrative cinema comes when you put those shots together. Suddenly they have context. They react to one another, surprising us or putting us at ease. Cut together, these shots can create whole new levels of meaning and evoke emotions in ways only cinema can. And the person whose job it is to make those cuts, to discover that emotional and narrative alchemy, is the editor. Like cinematographers, production designers, costumers, and makeup artists, editors must be part technician, part craftsperson, and part creative artist. They are responsible for understanding the technology of post-production, from editing software to integrating sound design, music, and special effects. But they also need to have a deep understanding of film grammar, a gut instinct for character, and a powerful sense of timing. They are the final guardians of the story and the emotional landscape of the film. A narrative film is a very fragile thing, and one misplaced cut can drastically change its meaning and impact. But as crucial as it is, the editor's job is also to hide their work. Usually their goal is to make the cuts appear so seamless that the audience doesn't even notice them at all. Like so many great artists, the best editors make their work look effortless. But trust me, it's not. Among their duties, editors must be able to sort through hours and hours of raw footage to find the story. They must train their visual memories to remember tiny differences between takes and shots and imagine how they might be cut together. They help the director separate the movie they wanted to make from the movie they actually shot. They are fresh eyes, unencumbered by the challenges of getting a shot or the heartbreak of the performance that didn't turn out. Editors must also have the taste to recognize when the story isn't working and the skills and experience to offer some solutions. Another way to think of it is that editors are the first audience for a film, an audience with the power to change it and make it even better. So how do they do it? In the beginning, editors worked with razor blades and tape to physically slice the film into shots and then join those shots together. It was painstaking work. One cut could take several minutes as opposed to the seconds it takes today using editing software. It was also more difficult to experiment with various cuts. There was no easy, quick way to go back and undo a particular edit, just more razor blades, tape, and time. An editing machine called a moviola became standard equipment for editors in the 1920s, and not a moment too soon. In addition to streamlining the process, the moviola allowed editors to watch the film as they were making their cuts. Then in the 1970s, flatbed editing systems like the Steenbeck and the Chem arrived. Now editors could move the film backward and forward to examine their edits and listen to the recorded soundtrack as they went. Flatbeds would remain the industry standard until the 1990s, when digital editing systems like the Avid emerged. We refer to physical film editing as linear editing because the process involves editing your way through the scene or the film in sequence, shot by shot, and choosing cut points as you go. It's also called destructive editing, since the editor is literally cutting the film, irreparably altering it with each transition between shots. When you edit digitally using computer software, that process is called non-linear editing. Here, you can scroll to any point in the scene or in the film with the touch of a button, joining and rejoining shots in any order as many times as you want. It's also called non-destructive editing. The main non-linear editing systems include the Avid, Apple's Final Cut Pro, and Adobe Premiere. Each system has its benefits and its drawbacks, and each editor must figure out what works best for each project in terms of budget, workflow, and ease of use. Now, when the footage comes in from the set, the editor's first step is to create an assembly cut. This is a very rough version of the movie that cuts each scene together in its most basic form. They're often very long and sometimes contain multiple takes of a given shot. The goal of the assembly cut is for the director and editor to see if they've captured the story. Are there any major plot points missing? Can the desired tone be achieved with the footage that they have? Are there any technical problems in the footage? Do the characters make sense? Where are the plot holes? Watching an assembly cut for the first time is often both a joyful and painful experience. There's your film all put together, coming alive for the first time before your eyes. But it's also usually a Frankenstein's monster of dead ends, missed shots, and performances that haven't been properly paced yet. But don't panic, because there's more work to do. The next step in the process is to make a rough cut, or several of them. This is the time for experimentation, for rethinking the structure of the film. What if this scene goes here? Do we even need this subplot, or this moment, or this shot? How can we build the tension, liven a flat scene, or make a joke funnier? The editor uses rough cuts to focus on the bigger parts of the movie that aren't working. It's also where the filmmakers can begin to get a sense of what the ultimate runtime of the movie will be. Once those issues have been solved, the editor moves on to the fine cut. At this point, the issues are smaller but no less significant. It's time to fine-tune performances, maximize emotional impact, trim some shots, and extend others. This is where you ask, when do we cut from one character to another? Is it better to extend this shot by 1 frame? 2 frames? 5? Ooh, how can we hide our crappy animatronic shark? 2 frames can make the difference between Jaws and Sharknado. Then we come to the final cut. At this point, we are achieving a locked cut, meaning no more changes to the duration or order of any shot in the film. Color correction is happening. Visual and sound effects are coming in. Music is being composed, recorded, and selected. ADR, or automated dialogue replacement, is being recorded and added to the film. And it's all being mixed so that every image and sound in the film exists in proper balance, fulfilling the vision of the director, who's now working through the editor and the post-production team. Each step in this process is specific and important, but not necessarily distinct. Every film is different, so often these stages blend into one another. The editor might have a brilliant restructuring idea in the fine cutting stage and open the film back up to rearrange some scenes. Or the director might have a sudden desire to extend a pivotal emotional beat just as the film is locking picture. However it happens, once all these steps are complete, so is the movie. And at every step in this process, the editor makes an indelible mark on the project, even if it's not always obvious. One of the most powerful effects of the editor's work is the ability to shift a film's perspective. Who the film cuts to at what moment and how long it remains on a character can influence the audience's identification with a character and their experience. Editors spend a lot of time asking questions like, whose scene is this and why? Usually followed by, does it have to be that way? And what if we tried it from another point of view? Very often the director is in the room for these conversations, and if they can be open to it, an editor's ideas can sometimes change the way they think of the film, opening up new and exciting possibilities. The more films you make, the more you realize you can't separate shooting and editing. They're bound together. The shots inform the editing and allow for all the experimentation that is to come. Cinematographers spend a lot of their own prep time thinking and talking about how their shots might cut together. It's all designed to tell the story and evoke the desired emotions. And so much of it comes down to when to cut and how the rhythm of those cuts contributes to the emotional and narrative experience of the story. The best editors collaborate very closely with directors and bring out the best in their work. The great Thelma Schoonmaker has been editing Martin Scorsese films since the earliest days of his career, from the split-second cuts of Raging Bull to the contemplative stillness of silence. Steven Spielberg has worked almost exclusively with Michael Kahn ever since Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Quentin Tarantino has long praised the late Sally Menke for corralling his impulses and bringing order to his films, from Reservoir Dogs to Inglourious Basterds. Walter Murch is one of the editing greats. He's cut everything from Apocalypse Now and The Godfather to The English Patient. He was among the first old guard editors to switch to a non-linear editing system, and he wrote the book on film editing called In the Blink of an Eye. In it, he lays out his 6 priorities for cutting away from one shot to another. The first is emotion. How does the shot affect the audience emotionally? What do you want them to feel? And does a cut add to that emotion or take away from it? The second is story. Does the cut move the story forward? Each cut needs to advance the story, not bog it down. Murch's third priority is rhythm. Just like music, he believes editing must have a beat, a rhythm, and a sense of phrasing. Is a cut interesting here or dull? What does it do to the pacing of a scene? Shake it up or flatten it?
A, I did not. And B, how did you know about that?
A, it's a small town. B, I'm not stupid. And C, they told me.
Right, well, I did once, but I was wasted, which was creepy because it was like there was 4 of them. I'm not proud of it. I am a bit.
Is this what you wanted to tell me?
No.
Fourth is something he calls eye trace. How does the cut affect where the audience focuses in the frame? The editor should be aware of where they want the audience to be looking and then use that to surprise or confirm their instincts, depending on what the scene is trying to accomplish. The last 2 priorities charge the editor with being aware of both the 2-dimensional place of the screen as well as 3-dimensional space. These are fancy ways of saying the cut has the power to maintain or disorient the audience as to the physical space within the scene. All told, the editor should be conscious of how the cut affects the audience's understanding of the world of the film. Editors are as vital to the filmmaking process as they are low profile. By the time the film is screening in the theater, no one knows the footage, the emotional beats, the pacing, and the performances better than the editor. Without them, we just have a pile of random footage. With them, we have magic.